Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The dust from the high desert wind was a gritty, unforgiving blanket, settling on everything, including the fragile, tear-streaked face of Alara as she stood on the scorched earth that had, only yesterday, been the ancestral home, the Willow Estate. The smoke, though hours old, still carried the acrid stench of burnt timber and the subtle, sickening sweetness of melted memories. It was not a natural fire. The police chief, a tired, honest man named Gideon, had already confirmed it was arson, and Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her blood more than the October wind, exactly who held the match. She pulled her threadbare, charcoal-colored cardigan tighter, the worn leather of the elbow patches feeling rough beneath her fingertips, a sharp contrast to the smooth, cool mahogany of her father's antique study desk, now nothing but a pile of ash and warped metal. The estate was more than just a house. It was a sprawling legacy of orchards, vineyards, and oil rights, a wealth that stretched back 4 generations, and now it was gone, leaving behind only the echo of her betrayal. Alara reached down, her fingers brushing against a strangely intact object half buried in the soot. A small, blackened cast-iron toy soldier, the very one her twin brother, Silas, had cherished as a boy, a sinister little signature left in the ruins of her life. This sudden, devastating loss was the culmination of a betrayal that had been fermenting for decades, a silent, corrosive jealousy that had finally erupted into violence. The morning had started with a letter, crisp and official, stating that the local bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on the estate, citing default on a loan Alara had never taken out, a detail that made no sense until Gideon pointed to the remains of a heavy-duty safe that had been expertly cracked open. Only one person knew the combination and the location of the spare copy of the estate's primary ledger, a book bound in deep green leather that detailed every asset, every deed, and every penny of the family fortune, Silas. He had been lurking in the periphery of their lives for years, a shadow of a man who only surfaced to borrow money or to whisper venomous critiques of Alara's management of the estate after their father's death. His eyes, always a startling pale blue, had recently taken on a strange, unsettling sheen, a feverish intensity she now recognized as pure, unadulterated avarice. He hadn't just wanted a share of the inheritance. He had wanted to dismantle her, to reduce her life to the same scorched rubble she was now standing on. Also, he could claim the insurance payout and whatever hidden deeds he'd managed to smuggle out before the flames danced. Alara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, the sound almost audible in the sudden, eerie silence of the countryside. She felt a dizzying combination of disbelief and incandescent fury, the kind of rage that burns so hot it feels cold. She was not a woman given to dramatics. She was a survivor, a farmer, and a shrewd businesswoman who had held this family's complex assets together through 2 economic downturns. Yet this act of calculated destruction had stripped her of her dignity and her home in one brutal stroke. The scent of ozone and ruin would clung to her clothes, a permanent reminder of the day her world imploded. She remembered a quiet conversation with her father, years ago, on the porch overlooking the now-dead willow tree, where he'd warned her, his voice low and heavy, that Silas's resentment was a ticking bomb, but she dismissed it as an old man's worry. Now, his words felt like a prophecy fulfilled, a curse she should have heeded. The betrayal wasn't just the fire. It was the years of silent planning, the feigned affection, the slow, systematic undermining of her authority in the community, all leading to this moment where her entire existence was reduced to ash. The sound of an approaching vehicle, a heavy 4x4, broke her morbid introspection, and she instinctively braced herself, her jaw tightening. It was not the police. Gideon's car was smaller, older. This was a pristine black truck, polished to a mirror sheen, the kind of vehicle that screamed wealth and attachment. It pulled up to the charred perimeter, and the driver's door opened with a slow, deliberate creak, revealing a tall, impeccably dressed man whose tailored suit seemed utterly out of place against the backdrop of ruin. He was a solicitor from the city, Mr. Alastair Vane, a man Alara had only ever dealt with over the phone regarding property deeds and tax issues. Yet the look in his cold, gray eyes was startlingly personal. He stepped over a fallen beam, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the soot, and he didn't offer condolences. Instead, he held out a crisp, legal envelope sealed with a wax crest she didn't recognize, his face utterly devoid of emotion. A final amendment to the will, Miss Thorne, delivered per the express instructions of your brother, Mr. Silas Thorne. Effective immediately. The paper felt like a viper in her hand, cold and venomous, and the implications of his presence and the timing of the document were a cold, sharp stab of understanding. Silas wasn't just destroying her past. He was eliminating her future, too. Alara's fingers tore the wax seal, the sound like a scream in the quiet morning air, and her eyes scanned the formal, dense legal language, her brain desperately trying to process the final, humiliating blow. The amendment wasn't about the fire insurance or the bank loan. It was a devastating codicil, dated just 3 days prior, that leveraged a rarely used clause in the original estate trust, which stipulated that if the primary beneficiary, Alara, was found to be in gross financial negligence leading to the physical destruction of estate assets, the entire remaining estate, including the profitable oil rights hidden deep beneath the land, would immediately revert to the secondary beneficiary, Silas. This document, which Silas had somehow coerced their elderly, frail family lawyer to sign, effectively branded her as the criminal responsible for the fire and stripped her of every last shred of ownership. The betrayal wasn't just an act of petty vengeance. It was a meticulously planned legal coup, a masterpiece of malice that had taken him a lifetime to orchestrate. Alara looked from the damning paper in her hand to the cold, distant horizon, the setting sun casting long, skeletal shadows of the ruined house, realizing that Silas hadn't just destroyed her life. He had officially erased her from the family legacy, leaving her destitute and discredited. The final, sharp sting was the realization that he was watching, somewhere in the distance, waiting for her to break. The year was 1978, and the Willow Estate was not a monument of ash but a sun-drenched haven, its sprawling Victorian architecture gleaming white against the endless azure of the Nevada sky. And this is where the seeds of Silas's bitter jealousy were first sown, long before he could even articulate the word inheritance. Alara and Silas were twins, identical in every visible aspect. The shock of midnight dark hair, the high cheekbones, the same inquisitive tilt of the head, but fundamentally different in the way they moved through the world. Alara was born first, just 17 minutes before Silas, a triviality that nonetheless seemed to establish an irreversible hierarchy in the eyes of their formidable father, Mr. Alastair Thorne, who ruled the estate with the absolute precision of a seasoned general and had an old-world reverence for primogeniture, even if it was a twin sister who arrived first. From their earliest days, Silas existed as Alara's echo, the second, the junior, the one whose cradle was placed slightly further from the sunniest window in the nursery, a subtle, almost imperceptible slight that, to a child's hypersensitive awareness, felt like a foundational rejection. Their father's love was a resource, strictly rationed and always contingent on performance, and while Alara seemed to effortlessly meet his demanding standards, Silas perpetually struggled, his small victories overshadowed by her effortless excellence, turning his childhood into a silent, agonizing campaign for recognition he would never fully win. Their mother, a kind, fragile woman named Clarissa, noticed the imbalance and tried to compensate with an almost smothering affection toward Silas, whispering reassurances that only seemed to deepen the gulf between the twins and fuel Silas's internal narrative of victimhood. While Alara was taught the practical skills of managing the estate, riding the fields with their father, learning to read balance sheets, and overseeing the temperamental irrigation systems, Silas was often left behind, drifting through the echoing, empty halls of the house, his resentment growing like a weed in the neglected corners of his young heart. He would often watch Alara from the window of the upstairs library, a heavy, dusty room filled with leather-bound books that smelled of age and forgotten knowledge, as she effortlessly charmed the workers or discussed crop rotations with their father, feeling a cold, hollow ache in his chest. It wasn't just attention he craved. It was the power, the unquestioned authority that seemed to radiate from Alara simply by existing as the firstborn. This early, profound feeling of being excluded from the inner circle, of being an afterthought in the grand, sweeping narrative of the Thorne family, began to twist his perspective, turning his youthful disappointment into a dark, corrosive envy that would later define his adult life, a slow-motion preparation for a betrayal decades in the making. One sweltering summer afternoon, when they were about 10, a seemingly innocuous incident occurred that cemented Silas's feeling of permanent secondary status and provided the first physical manifestation of his festering malice. Their father had acquired a magnificent, custom-made telescope, a brass and oak heirloom, intended as a shared gift, and he asked the twins to unpack it together on the wide, wooden porch. As Alara carefully lifted the delicate objective lens from its velvet casing, Silas, in a sudden, seemingly accidental movement, jostled her arm, causing the heavy lens to slip from her grasp and shatter on the slate floor. The sound a sharp, sickening crack that instantly silenced the buzzing afternoon cicadas. He immediately burst into theatrical tears, framing the incident as his own clumsy mistake and Alara's impatience, and their father, seeing Alara's stunned silence and Silas's frantic distress, delivered a severe, humiliating reprimand to her for failing to protect a valuable family asset, never once questioning the sincerity of Silas's performance. Alara, though devastated by the injustice, internalized the lesson. Silas was a master manipulator of perception, able to turn his malicious actions into her failures, and she realized, with a chilling clarity far beyond her years, that his greatest weapon wasn't strength or intelligence, but the subtle, insidious power of making others doubt her intentions while shielding his own. The emotional choreography of their lives continued this toxic pattern through adolescence, with Silas developing a polished, charming exterior that masked a core of brittle, desperate need, while Alara grew quiet, efficient, and fiercely protective of this state she knew would one day be hers, a stark contrast that only widened the emotional chasm between them. When their mother, Clarissa, finally succumbed to a long, debilitating illness during their college years, the loss completely shattered Silas, who felt he had lost his only true ally and shield against their father's unrelenting demands, pushing him further into the belief that life had dealt him an unforgivable hand, and that the only way to right the cosmic injustice was to claim what he felt he was owed. He watched with bitter fury as Alara stood stoically beside their father, offering comfort and managing the practicalities of the funeral, her competence read by Silas not as strength, but as an icy indifference to loss, confirming his deeply held conviction that she was too cold, too pragmatic, and ultimately unworthy of the vast emotional and material wealth she was destined to inherit. This moment marked a critical shift. His passive resentment began to harden into an active. The final, devastating psychological blow was delivered when their father passed away unexpectedly from a sudden heart attack 5 years later, leaving behind a concise, ironclad will that named Alara the sole executor and primary beneficiary of the entire Thorne estate, citing her unwavering commitment and proven ability to sustain the family legacy, and leaving Silas a simple, though generous, annuity and a small, non-controlling percentage of the minor oil royalties. The reading of the will was a scene of controlled devastation, where Silas listened to the lawyer's dry, legal pronouncements with an unnerving, frozen calm, his face pale and his eyes like chips of ice, an expression that terrified Alara more than any outburst. In that moment, watching his sister receive the keys to their kingdom, Silas didn't see an inheritance. He saw a lifetime of favoritism, a lifetime of being second, and a lifetime of being underestimated crystallized into a single, insulting document, and the quiet rage he'd nurtured since childhood finally crystallized into a singular, dark vow. He would not simply contest the will. He would spend the rest of his life meticulously constructing a scenario to not just take the inheritance, but to utterly destroy the person who received it, ensuring that Alara would lose everything, just as he believed he had lost everything decades ago in the nursery, beginning the silent, calculated campaign that would lead years later to the sight of the burning Willow estate and the crushing finality of the amended codicil. With the will formally read and the full weight of the Willow estate settling squarely on Alara's young shoulders, Silas, instead of contesting the document in a messy public court battle, adopted a far more insidious and patient strategy, the quiet siege. He departed the estate immediately, choosing to relocate to a small, nondescript apartment in the sprawling outskirts of Reno, a location close enough to monitor her actions, but distant enough to appear uninvolved, effectively creating a clean break that masked his corrosive intentions. He maintained a veneer of fraternal affection, sending occasional, carefully worded letters full of false concern for her well-being and subtle suggestions about management failures he'd noticed from afar, a tactic designed to destabilize her confidence without leaving any overt trace of hostility. His goal during this early period wasn't to seize the estate instantly, but to systematically weaken Alara's position, erode her credibility with the local banks and suppliers, and slowly drain her reserves through quiet, bureaucratic manipulations, a campaign of attrition that was virtually untraceable. He knew his sister possessed fierce resilience, a trait he both envied and feared, and understood that a direct assault would only strengthen her resolve. So he chose the path of the unseen enemy, the termite gnawing at the foundations while the house still stood tall and seemingly secure. Silas's first strategic move was to leverage a weakness he'd observed in their father's business dealings, an old, obscure mineral lease dating back to the 1930s on a remote parcel of this state land, a lease that legally obligated the current owner to pay a minimal annual fee to a dormant shell company based in the Cayman Islands. He resurrected this shell company using his annuity funds and an aggressive, newly acquired expertise in offshore finance, then began the delicate work of making the lease payments deliberately unreliable, sometimes a day late, sometimes short by a single, non-material dollar, creating a paper trail of technical noncompliance that he meticulously documented and filed away. When Alara would call him, confused about the paperwork for the minor plot of land, he would feign ignorance or offer vague, unhelpful advice, acting the part of the slightly hapless brother who was trying to help, all the while knowing that these seemingly insignificant failures were building a critical mass of evidence he would later use to invoke the complex negligence clause hidden deep within the estate's trust documents, the very clause he would activate decades later to finalize his scheme. He treated the estate not as a home, but as a fragile structure he was gently but persistently rocking, waiting for the perfect storm to arrive. Meanwhile, Alara, consumed by the crushing pressure of managing the vast, complex operation and the emotional toll of her parents' deaths, failed to recognize the calculated nature of Silas's interference, dismissing his strange behavior as the lingering instability of a man perpetually haunted by feeling second best. She threw herself into the work, spending long, exhausting days negotiating commodity prices, repairing failing infrastructure, and trying to modernize the estate's outdated agricultural methods, believing that hard work and efficiency would be her shield against any lingering threat. Her only relief came in the form of Jonas, the estate's kind and steadfast head foreman, a man whose quiet, unwavering support and deep knowledge of the land were her greatest assets. He was a silent observer who had known Silas since childhood and recognized the predatory glint in his eye even before the will was read. But out of loyalty to Alara, he kept his suspicions veiled, simply working harder to plug the subtle holes Silas was attempting to drill. Alara often sought Jonas's counsel, trusting his earthbound common sense over the polished advice of city lawyers, and their growing closeness, a bond built on shared labor and mutual respect, was another quiet source of simmering fury for Silas, who received regular, often twisted reports from a handful of disgruntled, low-level employees he had quietly cultivated as spies within the estate's workforce. Silas, armed with his growing legal knowledge and a truly chilling patience, next turned his attention to the local banking relationship, which was the lifeblood of the estate's operational capital. He didn't approach the main bank directly. Instead, he initiated relationships with several smaller, more aggressive private lenders, subtly inquiring about the Willow estate's financial structure, always framing his questions as a worried brother trying to understand his sister's risky financial exposure. He would casually mention outdated inventory reports and unfulfilled maintenance contracts, information he gleaned from his carefully placed spies, creating a low-frequency noise of doubt in the financial community about Alara's ability to manage such immense resources. These casual conversations, which contained no provable lies but were expertly laced with toxic innuendo, subtly raised the risk profile of the estate in the eyes of potential creditors, leading the main bank over time to quietly increase Alara's interest rates and tighten her credit lines, forcing her into a cycle of higher-risk loans just to maintain operations. The pressure was gentle, constant, and felt entirely like external market forces, obscuring the fact that the tightening noose was being slowly pulled by her own twin brother, who was patiently waiting for her to stumble into a financial corner from which she could not escape. Years turned into a decade, and Silas's plan remained invisible, a slow-motion catastrophe meticulously engineered beneath the surface of their lives. He watched from his distance as Alara aged prematurely under the strain, sacrificing her personal life and happiness to keep the failing irrigation systems running and the fluctuating market demands met, all the while thinking she was fighting the economy and nature, never realizing she was fighting a ghost of her own blood. He had learned the terrifying truth that a long game of slow erosion was more effective than any sudden blast, because it made the victim doubt their own competence, their sanity, and their fundamental worthiness of the inheritance. A deep psychological victory, far more satisfying than mere wealth. This decade of quiet siege was not a time of inaction for Silas. It was the construction of the final weapon, the massive, undocumented loan taken out in Alara's name, secured against the estate, the paperwork for which he had been diligently preparing, using the accumulated minor financial infractions and compromised documents to create a credible, undetectable forgery that would, on the day of his choosing, reduce the entire Thorne legacy to the cold, undeniable finality of a foreclosure. Notice in a pile of ashes. The turning point, the precise moment Silas moved from passive sabotage to active, structural destruction, occurred during Alara's 40th birthday, a milestone she marked not with celebration, but with the weary realization that 2 decades had passed since her parents' deaths, and the Willow estate, though surviving, was perpetually teetering on the edge of financial collapse. It was a bleak November evening, the low-hanging clouds mirroring the weight on her heart, when a large, ornately carved wooden box arrived via a private courier, addressed in Silas's distinctive looping handwriting. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded burgundy velvet, was an antique silver locket, a family heirloom that had supposedly been lost for years, along with a handwritten note that read, "Happy birthday, sister. May this bring you the peace you deserve. I know how heavy the keys to the kingdom weigh. P.S. Look inside the locket." The gesture felt profoundly unsettling. Silas had never been sentimental, and the sudden, public display of affection was completely out of character. Ringing alarm bells she immediately dismissed as paranoia fueled by exhaustion. She ran her thumb over the cool, etched silver of the locket, a small, beautiful object that felt surprisingly heavy in her hand. An internal struggle to believe her brother was capable of genuine warmth warred briefly with the cold, hard memory of his past manipulations. A battle the locket, for a moment, seemed to win. Following the cryptic instructions, Alara used the tip of a sewing needle to prise open the locket's twin compartments, expecting a miniature photograph of their parents, but instead finding 2 minuscule, tightly folded slips of paper. The first contained a single, chilling word written in permanent ink: insolvent. The second was a tiny, hand-drawn map detailing a forgotten access panel hidden in the deep, stone-lined cellar of the estate's main house, an area she rarely visited, which, according to the note, concealed a set of their father's hidden emergency documents, intended to provide a financial lifeline during a crisis. This was the brilliant, malevolent core of Silas's current plan, to present himself as a reluctant savior, forcing Alara to acknowledge her vulnerability and creating a scenario where she would willingly walk into a trap he had been setting for years. His performance as the concerned sibling reached its zenith here, framing the discovery not as her failure, but as a crisis averted by his timely intervention, a poisoned gift designed to elicit gratitude and absolute trust. She descended into the dank, earthy-smelling cellar that very night, clutching the locket and a flickering oil lantern, the cold air raising goosebumps on her arms, propelled by a desperate hope that this might be the salvation the estate so desperately needed. The hidden panel was exactly where the map indicated, concealed behind a stack of ancient wine crates that crumbled into dust when she moved them, revealing a small, rusty metal safe box cemented into the foundation stone. Inside, as promised, were a stack of documents bound with brittle, yellowed ribbon, appearing to be legitimate, signed financial instruments related to the Willow Estate's underlying oil rights, a secret stash of collateral their father had established outside the main trust, meant to be used only as a last resort. Among the papers, Alara found a set of blank but fully authorized power of attorney documents and a high-value, unsecured promissory note intended for her signature that would supposedly draw down on this hidden collateral to inject much-needed capital into the estate's failing operations, immediately resolving the crippling debt cycle. She felt a monumental wave of relief wash over her, a desperate gratitude that, for the first time in years, she wasn't facing ruin alone, blinding her to the critical fact that a truly legitimate, estate-saving asset would never be squirreled away in a damp cellar, nor would it require a blank power of attorney form. The emotional impact of the discovery, the sudden, intense hope, completely short-circuited her considerable business acumen. The next morning, acting on a sudden, reckless impulse born of exhaustion and trust, Alara called Silas and, fighting back tears of what she mistakenly believed was remorse and gratitude, asked him to come to the estate to help her execute the documents, trusting his technical expertise. Silas arrived promptly, impeccably dressed and radiating a practiced empathy that was almost unbearable, spending hours patiently guiding her through the intricate, jargon-heavy paperwork, ensuring she signed the promissory note and, crucially, the blank power of attorney document which he justified as necessary, just in case the bank needed immediate legal authorization to transfer the funds. As Alara signed, her hand trembling slightly with relief and a strange, residual doubt, Silas's expression remained placid, yet his pale blue eyes held a microscopic, chilling flicker of triumph, the silent, almost imperceptible closing of the final trap. She was so focused on the promised capital injection that she completely missed the small, almost invisible detail. The promissory note she signed was not a mechanism to draw on the hidden collateral. It was, in fact, the high-interest, unsecured loan, taken out in her name, that would eventually be used to cripple the estate and justify the foreclosure. With the signed power of attorney in hand, Silas immediately returned to Reno, now holding the legal key to her complete financial ruin. This single document, authenticated with Alara's signature and the estate's official seal, granted him the unilateral authority to manage her financial affairs, allowing him to legally execute the final stages of his lifetime plot. He used the blank form to access the main estate bank accounts, not to inject capital, but to quietly siphon funds into his resurrected offshore company, making the estate look artificially weak and indebted, and then used that same power to legally sign off on the huge, fraudulent loan he'd previously set up in her name, effectively leveraging her own assets against her. The locket, the emotional bait, now sat on her bedside table, a beautiful, cold reminder of her profound, catastrophic mistake, trusting the brother who had patiently waited 40 years for the perfect opportunity to destroy her life and seize her inheritance, an act of betrayal made possible not by force or fraud alone, but by a chilling, calculated manipulation of her desperate hope. The months following the signing of the poison power of attorney became a nightmare of slow, bureaucratic strangulation for Alara, who was convinced she was watching the estate die from natural causes, a perfect reflection of Silas's mastery of the invisible attack. The promised capital injection never materialized. Instead, the estate's operational cash reserves began to mysteriously evaporate at an alarming rate. Payroll bounced for the first time in the estate's history, disrupting the deeply entrenched loyalty of the long-term staff. Crucial shipments of fertilizer were delayed due to unforeseen wire transfer issues and the massive, expensive maintenance on the central irrigation pump, vital for the survival of the orchards during the dry season, was suddenly deemed unaffordable by the new, increasingly cautious bank manager. Alara was drowning in a sea of logistical failures. Yet every time she scrutinized the accounts, the paper trail led to complex, perfectly legal-looking transactions that indicated poor management, market volatility, or unexpected tax burdens. A ghost in the machine she couldn't catch. She looked drawn and perpetually exhausted, her dark hair streaked with premature gray, her sleep filled with terrifying dreams of the estate's massive, century-old willow tree, their namesake slowly withering into a gnarled, skeletal husk. The pressure became so intense that she rarely slept more than a few hours, often finding herself wandering the dark, echoing halls of the manor at 3 a.m., clutching the silver locket that now felt less like a gift and more like a cruel, mocking artifact of her devastating mistake. Silas, meanwhile, was conducting his campaign of financial terror from his remote Reno apartment with the cool detachment of a chess master, using the power of attorney as his primary instrument. He utilized the offshore shell company to funnel the estate's funds, creating a labyrinthine series of transactions across multiple foreign jurisdictions that made the missing money virtually impossible for any regional accountant to trace back to him. His strategy wasn't just about theft. It was a psychological operation designed to isolate Alara, to destroy her reputation and her ability to fight back. He began making anonymous calls to key suppliers and long-standing creditors, subtly hinting that Alara was experiencing a severe, near-total financial crisis, forcing them to demand cash payments up front or to simply cut off their services entirely, creating a devastating supply chain failure that ground the estate's operations to a near halt. This campaign of whispering doubt was expertly calibrated. Silas never explicitly defamed Alara. He just offered a brother's warning, framing his actions as necessary due diligence to protect his minor royalty interests from her alleged recklessness. His ultimate goal was to make Alara look so incompetent and desperate that when the final foreclosure notice came, the entire local community would believe she was solely responsible for the collapse of the mighty Thorne legacy. The emotional toll on Alara reached a breaking point when she was forced to let go of Jonas, the loyal foreman who had been her rock and her silent confidant for 2 decades, due to the complete depletion of the payroll reserves. The scene was devastating. Standing in the middle of the dust-blown equipment yard, surrounded by silent tractors, Alara stammered out the terrible news, her voice cracking with the shame of failure. Jonas, his face etched with concern, refused to take the final check she offered, understanding that the small amount should go to the few remaining workers, and his deep, steady gaze held a profound, heartbreaking mix of loyalty and fear. He didn't believe she had failed. He suspected a deeper, darker force at play, but he knew better than to accuse Silas without proof, aware that Silas had spies planted everywhere, listening and reporting on every conversation. As he drove away in his old, battered pickup, the image of his receding taillights felt like the final severing of Alara's connection to her former life, leaving her truly and utterly alone to face the inevitable downfall. This act of forced abandonment, engineered by Silas's financial blockade, was the most painful blow of all, demonstrating his willingness to destroy not just her wealth, but the very relationships that sustained her. In her desperation, and against the explicit warnings from the remaining, fearful staff, Alara made the reckless decision to contact Silas one last time, driven by a primal need to understand the source of the financial hemorrhage, holding on to the faint, flickering hope that he might yet be a confused ally, not an architect of her ruin. She drove the old, dented estate pickup truck all the way to Reno, finding his apartment complex a cheap, anonymous brick building that seemed completely incongruous with his polished facade, and confronted him on the landing outside his door, her voice raw with a blend of fear and accusation. Silas, leaning casually against the door frame, greeted her not with surprise, but with a chilling, practiced calm, his response perfectly scripted. "I warned you, Alara. The estate is a crumbling relic. You didn't listen to my advice, and now you blame me for your failures? I simply managed the annuity Dad left me and watched you run the place into the ground." He played the role of the disappointed, victimized brother with terrifying conviction, subtly shifting the narrative of blame back onto her, referencing her high-risk borrowing and her impulsive spending, all based on the fraudulent paperwork he had created. The confrontation ended not in a confession, but in a final, devastating emotional defeat for Alara. As she turned to leave, Silas delivered the ultimate, chilling dagger. "You should know, Alara," he said, his voice dropping to a low, cold whisper, "that the bank is tired of waiting. The foreclosure notice is already in the mail, and the lawyers are preparing to seize all assets. You see, I waited a lifetime to destroy you, not because I hated you, but because I deserved what Father gave you. And the worst part, you handed me the pen." The finality of his words, the casual, triumphant cruelty, stripped away any remaining doubt. She was not a victim of circumstance. She was the victim of a long con, a lifetime of meticulously planned malice that culminated in this moment of absolute, irreversible loss. Driving back to the dying estate in the pitch black, her mind numb, she knew two things for certain. The estate was lost, and Silas was no longer her brother. He was her executioner, and she had to find a way to fight back or lose not just the land, but her very soul to his decades-long revenge. Alara returned to the desolate Willow estate late that night, the engine's monotonous hum providing the only counterpoint to the deafening silence of her despair, knowing her confrontation with Silas had been not a rescue mission, but the final confirmation of her absolute ruin. The estate was eerily dark, the expensive exterior lights having been cut off by the utility company that morning due to non-payment, a final, humiliating punctuation mark on her financial collapse. She parked the old pickup by the charred remains of the main house, the smell of ash still faint but pervasive, and walked past the skeletal foundation, a visceral reminder of Silas's capacity for destruction. Reaching the only structure still fully intact, the small, stone-walled carriage house where she now slept on a cot, she collapsed onto the meager bedding, the silver locket still clutched tightly in her hand. It was this locket, the emotional bait that had led her to sign the power of attorney, that now captured her attention, its weight suddenly feeling immense and almost unbearable. In her numbness, she realized she had fixated on the betrayal, the paperwork, the fire, but she had failed to truly examine the gift itself, the very thing that had disarmed her caution. Driven by a desperate, last-minute spark of intuition, Alara rose and fetched a sturdy jeweler's loupe and a toolkit from her father's old work bench, her movements slow and deliberate, the silence of the night magnifying the click of every tool. She began to meticulously examine the antique locket under the harsh glare of a single utility lamp, scrutinizing the intricate filigree and the strange, non-traditional clasp. She noticed an anomaly. One of the floral etchings near the hinge was slightly deeper, a barely visible indentation that seemed out of place with the rest of the 19th century design. Pressing against this spot with the fine tip of a watchmaker's screwdriver, she felt a tiny internal spring mechanism release with a faint, metallic ping, and the bottom panel of the locket swung open, revealing a third, secret compartment that was smaller than the other two, concealed entirely within the locket's thick silver casing. This compartment contained no paper, no map, and no cruel words, but instead held a tiny, perfectly preserved strip of 35 millimeters photographic film, rolled tightly and protected by a thin layer of lacquer, a hidden clue that Silas had inadvertently included in his rush to deliver the initial, devastating message. Her hands shaking, Elara rushed outside to the back of the carriage house, where a deep, covered cistern used to collect rainwater was situated, and using the remnants of a chemical kit from her father's old study, which he used for developing photographs of the estate's development over the years, she worked feverishly to develop the single, crucial frame. The resulting image, viewed under the faint moonlight, was a grainy, high-contrast, black-and-white photograph, but its content was immediately and devastatingly clear. It was a clandestine shot of Silas, taken at night, standing next to a familiar figure, the very same solicitor, Mr. Alastair Vane, who had delivered the damning codicil. They were not merely talking. Silas was handing Vane a thick envelope stuffed with cash in exchange for a set of documents, the transaction taking place in the dimly lit parking lot of a city bank, the bank's ornate, recognizable logo visible on the background wall. The photograph wasn't proof of the fire, but it was far more valuable. It was undeniable visual evidence of a high-value, secret conspiracy between Silas and a crucial officer of the court, proving collusion and the suborning of legal counsel, suggesting that Vane was not merely an executor, but a paid accomplice in the fraudulent restructuring of the estate and the creation of the final, devastating legal documents. This single, tiny photograph, the locket's true, unintentional gift, exploded the narrative of Silas's innocence and Elara's negligence, revealing the depth and breadth of his cold-blooded, meticulously planned plot. The realization hit her with the force of physical trauma. Silas had used the locket, an object of sentimental value, to guide her to the fake documents, believing she would never find the secret compartment and that she would eventually discard the jewelry when she felt the weight of his betrayal. The photograph instantly shifted the entire battleground from the chaotic field of her alleged mismanagement to the clear, sharp arena of legal fraud and criminal conspiracy. Her spirit, which had been utterly crushed by the shame of financial ruin, suddenly surged with a fierce, cold clarity. She was no longer fighting merely for her home. She was fighting for her dignity, her reputation, and the opportunity to expose a lifetime of calculated cruelty that had been meticulously aimed at her. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of purpose so potent it felt electric. With the vital piece of evidence secured, Elara knew she couldn't rely on the local police, who were already convinced the estate's financial destruction was her fault, or the local legal system, which appeared compromised by Vane. She needed a new ally, someone removed from the immediate, contaminated influence of Silas and his network. She instinctively thought of Jonas, her foreman, the only person she truly trusted who possessed the practical skill and unwavering loyalty necessary for the next, dangerous phase. She knew he had settled temporarily with his elderly sister in a town 3 hours away, and the first light of dawn found Elara driving the old, sputtering pickup, the tiny piece of film sealed in a heavy, waterproof pouch around her neck. She was moving from defense to attack, the shame of being the victim replaced by the burning resolve of the avenger. The locket, once a symbol of her weakness, now hung heavy, a metallic promise of justice, the weight of its true contents, the photographic evidence, finally matching the immense, life-altering weight of Silas's betrayal, marking the end of the quiet siege and the beginning of the open, final war. Elara found Jonas in a small, rented room above his sister's dusty bakery, his hands perpetually dusted with flour, a weary but peaceful existence that was the antithesis of the toxic anxiety of the Willow estate. She didn't waste time on pleasantries, immediately spreading the tiny, fragile photograph on the worn wooden table, the high-contrast image of Silas and the solicitor, Vane trading cash and documents, instantly drawing a sharp, stunned breath from the loyal foreman. Jonas, who had spent a lifetime observing the subtle malice radiating from Silas, instantly understood the gravity of the image. It was the physical proof he had always suspected existed, the smoking gun that explained the estate's mysterious collapse. Seeing the photographic evidence galvanized Jonas, transforming him from a resigned former employee into a fiercely protective ally. The injustice done to Elara, whom he respected deeply, and to the land he loved, ignited a quiet, steady resolve in his eyes. They spent the entire day planning, their voices low and intense, mapping out Silas's financial movements based on Alara's recovered notes and Jonas's intimate knowledge of the local business players Silas had been manipulating. They realized the final, devastating move was imminent. The Willow estate was scheduled for an immediate, accelerated auction within 48 hours. A maneuver Vane had enacted using the fraudulent loan documents and the fire as justification to quickly liquidate the assets and seal Alara's fate, a move designed to prevent any legal recourse. The speed of the pending auction forced their hand, demanding a dangerous, high-stakes move that bypassed the corrupted local legal channels. Their plan was surgically precise. They needed to disrupt the auction and present the photographic evidence and the accompanying details of the conspiracy to an authority figure powerful enough to override Vane's influence. Specifically, a senior, uncompromised judge in the capital city, a man known for his rigid, uncompromising ethics and his profound distaste for fraud. But getting to the capital required money and time they didn't have, and stopping the auction meant facing Silas directly in the place where he felt most triumphant. They realized the only way to stall the sale was to prove that a crucial, non-liquid asset of the estate had been compromised by Silas after the foreclosure notice, which would trigger a lengthy police investigation and halt the immediate sale. This asset, Jonas revealed, was the hidden deed for the small plot of land where their father had recently discovered a minor, but strategically important, vein of high-quality gypsum, a resource known only to a handful of estate personnel, and a resource Silas would surely try to quickly strip mine before the sale, using the fraudulent power of attorney. Their final, desperate journey began under the cover of the black, pre-dawn sky as Alara and Jonas drove the aging pickup back towards the desolate estate. Their mission now shifted to catching Silas in the act of theft, rather than just chasing paper trails. They drove not to the ruined manor, but directly to the secluded, arid back lot where the gypsum was located, a remote area surrounded by scrub brush and dry, cracked earth. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the landscape mirroring Alara's own barren heart, a place of waiting, brittle silence. As the first pale sliver of light breached the horizon, they saw it, a heavy-duty excavator, freshly delivered, already tearing at the earth and standing beside a pristine, black SUV. Overseeing the illegal mining operation with a triumphant, proprietary air was Silas. He was on the phone, a confident smirk playing on his lips, completely unaware that the victim of his lifetime's plot was watching him, hidden in the shadows of the ancient, now dead willow tree on the perimeter of the property. The sight of her brother desecrating the land for a final, quick profit, completely convinced of his impunity, ignited a furious, cold resolve in Alara that transcended her grief. The ensuing confrontation was swift, brutal, and utterly cinematic, forcing Silas's carefully constructed facade to finally shatter under pressure. Alara and Jonas emerged from the darkness, Jonas moving with the quiet, purposeful speed of a farmer protecting his harvest, while Alara walked straight toward Silas, the rising sun casting a long, terrifying shadow behind her, the silver locket clutched in her hand. Silas's reaction was immediate and violently hostile. The shock of seeing Alara, whom he believed was already defeated and preparing to flee, was instantly replaced by an unmasked, savage fury. He shouted for his hired driver to call the police, claiming Alara was trespassing and attempting vandalism. But Jonas quickly and silently disabled the excavator's engine, ensuring no further damage could be done. Alara didn't argue. She simply held up the tiny photograph, letting the direct beam of the rising sun catch the glossy surface, illuminating the undeniable image of him bribing Vane. "It wasn't just the fire, Silas," she said, her voice low and steady, a terrifying calm replacing her years of anxiety. "It was the locket, the fake loan, the power of attorney, a lifetime of lies. And I have the proof of your collusion." Silas stared at the photograph, his face draining of color, the triumphant smirk replaced by a look of pure, visceral panic, his years of calculated composure dissolving into desperation. He lunged at Alara, not for the evidence, but with the primal intent to silence her. But Jonas, standing between the twins, intercepted him with a heavy, steady force, pinning him against the side of his own expensive car, ensuring no one was harmed, but ensuring Silas was utterly contained. In that moment of intense physical restraint, the years of silent resentment and the crushing weight of their father's favoritism erupted from Silas in a torrent of venom. "You took everything," he screamed, his voice raw and broken. 17 minutes. 17 minutes of accident, and father gave you the world. You were always the worthy one. I waited a lifetime to destroy you because you never deserved it. His desperate admission, a confession of the driving, decades-long envy that fueled his every malicious act, hung heavy in the dry morning air, witnessed by Jonas, and captured by the hidden phone camera Alara had discreetly activated during her walk toward him. This confrontation, held over the stolen land in the blistering heat of the impending drought, was the end of Silas's hidden war. The financial plot was now exposed as a deeply personal, criminal betrayal fueled by a childhood slight, setting the stage for the final, necessary. The ensuing 48 hours were a blur of high-stakes, frantic action, a desperate race against the clock as Alara and Jonas leveraged the confession and the photographic evidence to completely dismantle Silas's carefully constructed empire of lies. With Silas subdued and awaiting the arrival of the county sheriff, whom Jonas had contacted immediately after the confrontation, Alara used the secretly recorded audio of his furious confession, the raw, undeniable admission of his decades-long envy and his plot to destroy her, to secure an emergency ex parte injunction against the impending estate auction. She didn't go to the local courthouse, which she knew was compromised by Vane. Instead, she and Jonas drove nonstop to the state capitol, presenting their evidence directly to the senior judge Alistair Kincaid, a figure known for his ruthless pursuit of integrity, arriving at his chambers just 2 hours before the auction was scheduled to begin. The judge, an imposing man with a severe, penetrating gaze, reviewed the photographic proof of Vane's cash bribe, listened to the chilling audio recording, and examined the paperwork detailing the fraudulent loan, his expression hardening with every passing moment, realizing this was not a civil dispute but a massive, deep-rooted criminal conspiracy that threatened the credibility of the entire regional judiciary. Judge Kincaid, recognizing the urgency and the potential scope of the fraud, acted with swift, decisive authority. He immediately issued a cease and desist order on the Willow Estate auction, declaring the primary underlying loan void ab initio, invalid from the start, due to evidence of systemic fraud, and further issued a warrant for the immediate arrest of the solicitor, Alistair Vane, on multiple counts of conspiracy, fraud, and suborning. The news rippled through the financial and legal communities like a shock wave, completely appending the narrative of Alara's incompetence that Silas had so painstakingly built over 2 decades. The swift action not only saved the estate, but also provided Alara with an immediate psychological advantage. The invisible power that had been crushing her, the belief that the system was against her, was instantly reversed. She watched with a grim satisfaction as the news broke on her phone, showing the elegant, impeccably dressed Vane being led away in handcuffs from his downtown office. The picture a searing symbol of justice finally catching up to the powerful and the corrupt, a proof that the truth, when armed with evidence, could fell even the most established enemies. Meanwhile, Silas, who had been taken into custody for trespassing, property damage related to the gypsum mining and grand larceny, found his carefully constructed world dissolving in the cold reality of the local jail. The initial charge for trespassing, which he had expected to easily dismiss, was quickly upgraded when Judge Kincaid's orders arrived, citing him as a primary co-conspirator in the Vane case and freezing all his assets, including the offshore accounts where he had funneled the estate's funds. The shock was profound. Silas had always believed that his financial maneuvers were too complex, too protected by layers of legality to ever be truly exposed, completely underestimating his sister's tenacity and the sheer, unyielding power of the one piece of evidence he had carelessly provided, the secret photograph in the locket. His initial arrogance crumbled into terrified desperation. The man who had spent a lifetime patiently waiting to achieve his cruel victory suddenly found the very inheritance he coveted. The vast oil rights and the land itself was now secured not by his treachery, but by his sister's resolve and the cold, unfeeling hand of the justice system he had attempted to manipulate. The psychological impact of his arrest was intensified by a surprise visit from the lead detective assigned to the arson investigation, who, armed with the new evidence of financial motive and the power of attorney documents, informed Silas that the cast-iron toy soldier found at the scene of the fire, the same soldier Alara had seen, was confirmed to have his fingerprints and trace evidence of accelerant, turning the charge of larceny and fraud into potential first-degree arson with intent to defraud. The detective's voice was flat and dispassionate as he described the meticulous planning, the years of quiet undermining, and the final, destructive act, revealing that Silas's ambition had driven him past mere financial crime into outright violence. The reality of a life sentence, the loss of his freedom, and the complete failure of his lifelong plot crashed down on him, forcing him to face the devastating price of his envy. He had sought to destroy Alara's life to gain an inheritance, and instead he had destroyed his own, left with nothing but a jail cell and the bitter, suffocating knowledge that the only person he had truly defeated was himself. Back at the Willow estate, now legally protected and still standing despite the fire, Alara sat alone in the carriage house, reading the official notice from the court. The air was different. The oppressive, draining pressure of the unseen strings was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound exhaustion and the dawning realization of her freedom. The estate was safe, the betrayers were caught, and the years of silent suffering had finally culminated in a painful but undeniable victory. She looked at the silver locket, now resting on the table beside the court documents, no longer a symbol of her mistake, but a relic of her resilience, a physical manifestation of the fact that even the most carefully hidden truths can be brought to light. The emotional high of the fight had faded, leaving a hollow space where her life used to be. But in that quiet moment, looking out at the scorched earth that would soon be healed, she understood that the true inheritance was not the land or the wealth, but the enduring strength and clarity of character she had gained while fighting a war she didn't know she was in, preparing her for the long, difficult path of rebuilding her home and her heart. The moment of absolute emotional and physical tension arrived not in a courtroom or on the burned grounds, but in the tense, sterile visiting room of the maximum security correctional facility where Silas was being held. Stripped of his fine suit and his lifetime of carefully constructed deception, Alara, accompanied by Jonas, who insisted on being present as her witness and protector, arrived 3 days after Silas's full arraignment, her purpose not to gloat, but to secure the final piece of the puzzle, the location of the original Thorne Estate ledger. This green, leather-bound book, containing the true, untainted financial records and the hidden deeds to the immensely valuable mineral rights, was the only thing that could fully restore the estate's financial solvency and protect the future of the remaining assets from the inevitable, lingering legal attacks by Silas's co-conspirators. The room was small, separated by a thick sheet of reinforced glass, forcing them to speak into a static-filled phone receiver, the physical barrier emphasizing the unbridgeable chasm of betrayal that lay between them. Alara wore a simple, dark dress, a symbol of her quiet power, and her eyes, though exhausted, held a deep, unshakable resolution that utterly unmasked her brother's pathetic, defeated state. Silas, on the other side of the glass, was a portrait of shattered arrogance. His usually pristine hair was disheveled, his pale eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and his hands trembled visibly as he held the receiver. He tried weakly to reassert his old manipulation, first offering a pathetic plea for forgiveness, then quickly swinging to a desperate, last-ditch attempt at leverage, claiming the ledger was his only remaining bargaining chip and demanding Alara drop the arson charges in exchange for the book's location. Alara cut him off, her voice low, clear, and utterly devoid of emotion, a tone that silenced his rambling immediately. She reminded him that the physical evidence, the toy soldier, the power of attorney, the bank records, and the damning audio of his confession meant he faced a minimum of 25 years for arson and conspiracy, regardless of the ledger's existence. Her goal wasn't to punish, but to ensure the family's survival, and she told him simply that his lifetime plot had failed, and his revenge had only succeeded in destroying him. The raw, unvarnished truth of his catastrophic failure, that he had waited a lifetime to destroy her only to destroy himself, finally broke his control, causing him to slump forward, his head bowed in a mixture of shame and fury. It was Jonas, speaking softly into his own receiver, who provided the final, unexpected catalyst that cracked Silas completely. He didn't speak of betrayal or justice. He spoke of their childhood, of the long hours they spent working the fields together, and how their father, in his own harsh way, had loved them both, but feared that Silas's sensitivity and pride would make him unfit to lead the tough, demanding life of the estate manager. Jonas revealed that the original will, while naming a Lara executor, had included a highly valuable, secret educational trust fund for Silas, tied to his completion of a specific business degree, a fund he never claimed, seeing it as charity rather than inheritance. This revelation, that their father had tried to care for him, just differently, shredded Silas's lifelong, core narrative of being unjustly abandoned and fueled his subsequent, decades-long resentment, a psychological foundation for his crimes. The realization that his entire motive, the wellspring of his hatred and the justification for his destructive plot, was based on a fundamental misinterpretation of his father's intentions, was a blow far more devastating than any prison sentence. In a voice barely above a whisper, choked with years of pent-up resentment and agonizing regret, Silas finally confessed the ledger's location. It wasn't hidden in a bank vault or a safe deposit box, but in the one place he knew Alara would never think to look again, inside the pedestal of the charred, ruined fountain in the courtyard of the burned manor, a spot he had deemed fitting for an object of such importance, hidden in plain sight amidst the destruction. He described in horrifying detail how he had carefully wrapped the ledger in fireproof material and sealed it within the hollowed-out stone base just hours before setting the fatal blaze, knowing the massive stone would protect it from the heat. This final act was the ultimate, ironic punchline to his plot. The prize he waited a lifetime to steal was now the tool that would secure his sister's victory and ensure his own long, bitter defeat. He looked up, his eyes meeting Alara's through the glass, no longer with hatred, but with a profound, terrifying emptiness, the look of a man who had won the battle only to realize he had lost everything that mattered. Alara and Jonas left the facility immediately, driving straight back to the scorched willow estate, the low winter sun setting as they arrived at the desolate courtyard. The air was cold, the silence immense, broken only by the sound of their feet crunching on the soot and debris. Following Silas's directions, they found the colossal, blackened stone fountain pedestal. Working together with a pry bar and a flashlight, they slowly and laboriously cracked open the heavy stone base, revealing the perfectly intact, deep green, leather-bound ledger. The sight of the book, smelling faintly of dry leather and old paper, was the visual and emotional climax of the story. It wasn't just a book of accounts. It was the undeniable proof of Alara's rightful ownership, the ultimate repudiation of Silas's malicious ambition, and the key to the future. As Alara carefully lifted the book, its weight a reassuring presence in her hands, she looked up at the skeletal remains of the Willow estate, knowing that the fire had been the price of a devastating lie, but the ledger was the undeniable promise of the phoenix from the ash, the powerful, empowering rebirth of her legacy and her life. The discovery of the original Thorn ledger, protected within the stone fountain, marked the true, definitive end of Silas's destructive plot and the powerful beginning of Alara's rebirth. With the authentic records in hand, she spent the next week systematically undoing the decades of financial damage, working with Judge Kincaid's appointed auditors to prove that the estate was not only solvent, but immensely wealthy, its liabilities negated by the sheer value of its assets, including the undisputed deeds to the vast, untapped oil and mineral rights. The ledger was the unburnt testament to her family's true legacy, revealing financial reserves that Silas's manipulations had completely obscured, and its pristine condition, preserved from the fire that consumed everything else, became a potent metaphor for Alara's own unburnt soul. The legal fallout was swift and absolute. Silas and Vane were denied bail, facing long sentences for their conspiracy and arson, their own assets completely seized to cover the massive damages and legal costs. The inheritance Silas had schemed a lifetime to steal was now legally, undeniably, and ethically Alara's alone, her ownership validated not just by the will, but by her enduring fight to protect it. The most profound change, however, occurred not in the legal documents, but in the physical landscape of the Willow estate, now transformed from a scene of tragedy into a powerful symbol of resilience. Alara, armed with the rediscovered wealth, didn't choose a quick, modern rebuild. Instead, she initiated a patient, meticulous restoration, ensuring every beam replaced and every stone laid honored the memory of her parents and the land's history. She prioritized healing the land itself, commissioning Jonas, now officially reinstated as the estate manager and her indispensable partner, to begin a massive reforestation project to replace the trees lost to the drought and the fire, a physical act of regeneration that mirrored her own emotional recovery. Jonas, whose unwavering loyalty had been her shield and sword, stood beside her, his quiet strength a constant reassurance. Their partnership, forged in the crucible of betrayal and survival, blossomed into a deep, mutual respect, one that promised a future built on truth and shared purpose, not on the toxic foundation of sibling rivalry and deceit. The work was hard, the dust was still present, but now it was the healthy dust of construction, not the bitter ash of destruction. Alara's final, most empowering act was to use her secured wealth to establish the Clarissa and Alastair Thorne Legacy Fund, a trust designed to provide educational grants for the children of the estate's long-term workers, ensuring that the next generation would have opportunities that transcended the land itself. This was her profound, final repudiation of Silas's greed. She transformed the family wealth from a source of destructive envy into a force for communal good, healing the community Silas's betrayal had fractured. She even found peace regarding her father's complicated legacy, understanding that his harshness and his favoritism were rooted in a deep, flawed desire to protect the estate, but that the true legacy was what she chose to do with the inheritance, not just the fact of receiving it. Her journey had stripped her of her innocence and burdened her with a terrible knowledge, but in return it had given her an iron will, a clear purpose, and the understanding that her greatest strength was not in managing accounts, but in her capacity for endurance and her refusal to let darkness win. Years later, the Willow estate stood proud and restored, a beacon of strength against the Nevada horizon. The scorched earth was green again, the new growth reaching eagerly toward the sun, and the manor, rebuilt stone by stone, honored its past while facing a bright, sustainable future. Alara, now standing tall and resolute, watched a group of children laughing by the restored fountain, the very spot that concealed the truth that saved them, her own features softened by contentment, her dark hair now elegantly streaked with silver. Her life was no longer defined by the twin brother who hated her, but by the community she nurtured and the legacy she protected. She had fully integrated the painful lesson. The betrayal was a lifetime in the making, but her resilience was stronger, a force that transformed the fire into a purification and the loss into an absolute, empowering victory. The story of the twin who waited a lifetime to destroy his sister for her inheritance became a quiet legend in the region, a sobering tale told to remind people that the deepest, darkest betrayals often come from the closest sources, and that patience and malice are a terrifying combination. But more importantly, it became a story of justice and ultimate healing, a reminder that even when reduced to ash, a person's dignity and true worth can never be incinerated, and that the ultimate inheritance is the strength found in survival. Alara had not just inherited a fortune. She had inherited herself, a woman defined not by her wealth, but by the quiet, fierce power to rebuild from the ground up, turning her brother's lifetime of hate into the bedrock of her own enduring, unburnt legacy.